growth. Now, many businesses have raised concerns of lengthy processing and securing work visas, citing these delays are significant constraints on economic expansion. For more on his plans and vision, we are now joined by the newly appointed Home Affairs Minister Leon Schreiber. Minister Schreiber, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Of course, you're with the Democratic Alliance, so there's a lot of curiosity about what you're going to be doing with this very, very important ministry. But before we get into that, congratulations. Perhaps tell us about, what you're wanting to focus on post your swearing in tomorrow as one of your key priorities. Why today you're being sworn in. Why the focus on work visas as your priority?
Good morning, Naledi, and thank you very much for the kind wishes. As we all know, this is a portfolio with a mountain of work, but I've got my boots on, so I'm ready to tackle that. Yes, indeed. I mean, the visas issue is one among many of the priorities we need to tackle in this department. I think the first and most important one of those is getting the basics right. And those basics relate not only to the processing of visas that can serve as an economic catalyst for South Africa in places where we have scarce skills or people with exceptional skills, but also in the day-to-day operations. And I think this is the most important place for us to start this conversation, because I think most South Africans understand the problems at Home Affairs on the basis of the endless queues that they sometimes face, on the basis of this terrible South Africanism called system offline. And I really am very passionate about starting with those kind of basics. I want the system to be online. I don't want it to be offline. I want the queues to shorten and eventually to be defeated altogether. And those are things that you tackle with business process reforms, with investments in IT infrastructure and upgrading the network and the capacity of Home Affairs offices. And then, of course, also on the other side, speeding up the processing of some of these critical economic enablers, including things like critical skills visas, I serve on the Council of Stellenbosch University, for example, and we have lost academics who had to leave the country, who had specific skills that we wanted to transfer to South Africans, but they had to leave the country because they were not able to get the documents they needed. Those are the kind of economic impacts that we can have if we tackle this issue. And more broadly, we can restore dignity to the experience of Home Affairs. I think that for me is really the fundamental point. Home Affairs is what makes us all South African. Yeah. We get our ID documents there. It's the first government department we interact with when our parents go to collect our birth certificates. And it is also the last one that touches our lives if our loved ones have to go and collect a certificate when we pass away. So it's fundamentally about dignity and our identity.
It's interesting because it's almost hard not to make the juxtaposition between what you're putting forward as your priority to get work visas and skills into the country when your predecessor, for instance, just now on the 18th of June, lost in an appeal in court there. This is in the ZEP matter, right? So I'm keen to hear your view on what we do about ZEPs. At the moment, those permits are up until, 2025? Would you want to extend them? It's been quite a hot potato issue in the run-up to these elections.
Look, I think we have to approach all of these things on the basis of what our Constitution tells us. And you'll see in the Statement of Intent for the Government of National Unity as well, that this is a government, even though it's made up of multiple parties, that will ground itself in what the Constitution and the rule of law says. Now, the courts have spoken on the particular way in which this matter has been handled. I will obviously need some time to go and review the processes and what some of the missteps were in this regard. But I think the fundamental point to make is that we must uphold the law. On the one hand, that means that obviously where there is fraudulent activity or where people have engaged in corruption to obtain certificates or have corrupted that system that you mentioned, that is something that there will need to be consequences for. And we must uphold the law in that space. But just as much on the other side, we also have to look at the way in which people who try to get legal paperwork are being failed by processes within the department. And that is something where some of the major problems and court cases actually emanate from, because you cannot punish a person when the department itself has failed to facilitate what may have started as a legal application.
Just allow me to step in.
So that's the balance that we're going to get right.
Yeah, allow me to step in, because I think this is an important topic and almost a different one to what you're talking about, which is certainly one that's key, right? The processing of paperwork and documentation. But the ZEP essentially is that permit that was given to Zimbabweans in the mid to late noughties, right? To say you are able to come and live in South Africa and live a full life almost as a citizen in South Africa because of the toil that took place in Zim. So the previous minister saying that needs to come to an end. Would you agree with that briefly, if you will?
Well, I just don't think it's that clear cut. There has to be a process for persons who have tried to legalize themselves, people who have tried to apply for other visas, for example, where they have managed to contribute skills to the economy, to actually obtain the paperwork where they have complied with the law. But then on the other side, of course, that's why I started by saying, where there are persons who do not meet the criteria, that is where we will have to review that system. But I must say to you, Naledi, it's very important to make this point. You know, the international community places a lot of pressure and wants South Africa to play its role in managing international migration. But just yesterday in my initial briefing with the department, I was made to understand that there's been significant cuts to the ability of South Africa to actually process things like asylum papers and even from our neighboring countries. And, you know, that's something I have to take up very urgently as well with the international community, because expecting South Africa to step up to our responsibilities when it comes to migration as one of the biggest recipients of migration, including from neighboring countries like Zimbabwe in Africa, must surely come with assisting South Africa to be able to do that. And I think that's where a huge part of the process has fallen by the wayside, because it takes resources, it takes manpower, it takes the ability to distinguish, and this is the fundamental point, distinguish between those people who have immigrated, even on the ZEP, and who have since contributed their skills and tried to apply for other visas to help build South Africa, and those who have undermined the system. We cannot distinguish between the two if we don't have the capacity. And that is really where the fundamental first step lies. When it comes to legal reforms and policy reforms, those are things that I need to sink my teeth into, and then we'll see the way forward on that.
Yeah, because obviously you're going to have to work with quite a few departments. I mean, I think about some of the issues around our porous borders that people talk about, right? What was it in December when we saw something like 400 children that were allegedly being trafficked into the country at some of our border posts, and that requires work with various other departments. Are you confident in the leadership of those departments? You talk about international relations, Ronald Lamola heading up DIRCO?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a particular issue that I look forward to discussing with Minister Lamola, because as I say, I think we can use some international platforms to make the case for why Africa shouldn't be punished when you have migration crises and wars in other parts of the world, and then South Africa ends up being defunded. So I think that is something we must take up. I also have great confidence in my colleague, Mr. Dean McPherson. And I'm very excited about the fact that he's been appointed at Public Works, which, as you know, is actually responsible for things like border fencing and the infrastructure that's required there. So that's a conversation that I will also be having with him, and to make sure that we start moving on in this space. I mean, you know, the Border Management Authority is an entity that was established last year under Home Affairs. I think it's quite an innovative reform. But it is also wholly undercapacitated and lacking in resources. So I think we need to go and look where we can find partners, where we can find support also in financial terms when the government budget is under pressure the way that it is. And then we need to collaborate, exactly as you say, whether it's international relations, public works, policing, and that is something that I look forward to driving from the Home Affairs perspective, including from the immigration perspective.
What's your priority internally? I mean, I've gotten these numbers from a World Bank having said that there are 15 million people who are undocumented in South Africa, but I think that, you know, you could perhaps have a clearer idea of what those numbers would look like. But your concern with things within the country and the everyday South African, what's your priority briefly, if you will?
Yes, I think that's where I go back to my initial point, and really the overriding priority, which is to turn a visit to Home Affairs or an interaction with Home Affairs, because it doesn't always have to be online, in person. You can look at online solutions as well, but turn that into a more dignified experience so that people don't use the phrase system offline as some kind of joke. It needs to go away. It needs to be dealt with. So that's really the priority, investing in human resources, uplifting staff who go out of their way to work hard, holding accountable people who are involved in corruption and maladministration, embracing technology so that we can push the kind of reforms that we need, and ultimately make it a dignified experience so that you can feel that the department that gives you your South African identity, quite literally, is one that is moving forward. It's not going to be an overnight fix. I have to be clear about that before I go, Naledi. No one can expect this department to be fixed overnight. But if we can get South Africans to believe again that things can get better, even at a place like Home Affairs, then I think we would have done the country a great service.
Okay, well, I'm really glad that you spoke to us, because now we get an idea of, you know, the lessons that you learned from your predecessor, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi. Before I let you go, there's obviously the curiosity around when the incoming ministers were made aware that they will be ministers. I mean, you're 35 years old, and I thought it was important to highlight that you're, you know, rather young, 35 years old. When did you find out that you were going to be Home Affairs Minister, and what was that reaction?
Yes, look, I hope to leverage some of the energy that comes with still having, you know, not been through the washing machine, and I really want to really hit the ground running, which is why I've already had my first meetings with the department yesterday that went really well, and there's some really good people there that I look forward to working with. But to answer your question, I did not know from the president himself until my name was actually called on screen. I did not receive a phone call from the president. However, earlier in the day, DA leader John Steenhuisen, of course, reached out to the DA component to see whether we are available. But I must be honest with you, I did not believe that it would actually happen until the moment when he said my name. And of course, it was the moment in which things changed for me personally in quite a dramatic way, and a moment for which I'm very grateful, because now I get to serve my country in the executive, and what a privilege to be able to do that at the age of 35.
Yeah, what's that reaction quickly when you hear the words, your name, come out of the president's mouth?
Well, I was sitting on the couch with my wife, and I think I almost fell off. That's the only way I can summarize it.
All right. Well, we'll be watching your tenure very, very closely, and we really do appreciate your time. That's our incoming Home Affairs Minister, Leon Schreiber. You'll be getting sworn in today in Cape Town.